Just whistle.
Everyone, and welcome to the Terror Zone. I am your host, Foxy Loxy. Today we will be discovering the dark version story of the Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Dwarfs. Sorry, I have trouble saying that word. But before I refresh your memory of the Disney version, I'll refresh your memory on the Disney version we are familiar with. Snow White is a beautiful princess who dreams of marrying a handsome prince that loves to marry her. She lives in a castle with her evil stepmother, the queen. Every day, the queen would ask her magic mirror who is the fairest of them all. And it would always answer that she was, until one day the mirror said that Snow White was the fairest. So she got angry and jealous. So she decides to send the huntsman to kill her and to give her heart. But the huntsman, once he took Snow White with her and to kill he couldn't bring himself to do it. So he tells Snow White what's going on, and she runs away. And runs into the forest. And then later on, she was very scared and terrified until she realizes that all the things that she was afraid of was just a forest with animals. And the animals kind of introduced themselves like normal animals would, be with, like I would if I didn't have any words to say. They became her friends, and eventually the animals helped her find a cottage where she could live, away from the queen and everything. And stays with them. The dwarfs were a little skeptical at first when they first met her, and they were mining for diamonds like that. But they quickly warmed up to her eventually when they said that she would cook and clean and do all that stuff for them. Later, the queen finds out where she was living and decides to kill Snow White with a poisoned apple. One day, when the 7D went to their mine while they were there, the queen disguised herself as an old woman. And gives Snow White the apple. Snow White eats it and faints. The dwarfs heard about this from the animals and followed the queen to a cliff. The queen was going to try to throw a rock on them when accidentally the cliff collapsed and ended up her falling to her doom. And the vultures eat her after. Yes, I am not joking. That is actually a Disney version. I am not telling any dark jokes just yet. Trust me, it gets much worse than this. after the dwarfs, after all this, the dwarfs put Snow White in a casket and laid her out. And for a few days she stayed that way in the casket with flowers and the snow and dwarfs crying, until one day on the funeral the prince comes and kisses Snow White, waking her up. Becomes happy, and Snow White and the prince go to his castle to live happily ever after, married. The end. And that was the Disney version of the Snow White story we all know and love. Now here is the original version of Snow White. In the beginning of Snow White, here, the story, in this story, Snow White is 7 years old. Girl that lives with her stepmother, who is jealous her beauty, much like the Disney one. The beginning is the same until we get to the huntsman, where he decides to kill a bear cub instead of Snow White, and lets her go. She runs off in the forest. I should probably mention that the queen wanted to actually eat her liver and heart when the huntsman would give it to her. I should probably mention that. Forest. For a few days until, gross. Yeah, it was pretty gross. Anyway, Snow White finds a cottage where the dwarfs live. Between this scene is that the cottage is actually very clean, unlike Disney version where it's very dirty. Eventually, she falls asleep on their beds. When she wakes up, she is surrounded by the 7D. The 7D made a decision where Snow White cooks and cleans the house in the exchange for living with them. A days passed, and the queen asked the mirror, who is the fairest of them all of the land. The mirror tells that Snow White is alive, and she did not eat her heart. That was the cub. The queen gets mad and decides to do 3 attempts to kill Snow White. The first one was she decided to disguise herself as an old lady that sells Snow White to lace her dress, which is like in medieval times where they had those laces on their dresses. That's what she would be selling to her. It's just in it. After the queen pulls it so hard on the lace, and that soon enough, that makes Snow White choke and faint. Luckily enough, the 7D came back from their work and actually realized what just happened and takes off the least dress that Snow White was wearing, and she actually survived. So that attempt did not work. Let's just say. And she was able to breathe again, Snow White. The second attempt was the queen disguised herself as another old lady and gives Snow White a comb, and she puts it in her hair and make her, just brush. But again, makes her faint, pass out. But again, the 7D came back to save her and took the comb out of her hair. And she was survived once again. But a third attempt was the one we know. The poisoned apple. This plan was a success. And she decides, and unlike the Disney version, she disguises herself as a husband's wife in this one, where she is just, instead of an old lady like she was supposed to do in the original. This plan was a success. She decides Snow White eats it and dies. The 7D came back heartbroken. And they decide to not to have a clear casket like the one the Disney version to have. And they would keep her in a casket in the middle of their area, and they would come every day to watch her from when they would do their work and stuff like that. And one day, a prince decided to come and live with them because he was traveling in the woods one day. And one day he came up upon Snow White, and he thought she was beautiful, and decided to take her home to his castle. In some way, he convinced the 7D to take Snow White home with him. While carrying the casket, somebody trips while carrying it, and she spits out some piece of the apple, and she awakes. And the prince sees that. And the prince decided to ask if he can marry her, and Snow White says yes. And they get married. And because this was a royal wedding, the queen was invited. The queen decided to go to the wedding after the prince and Snow White. When they decided her to wear burning shoes that were on the heat, and she was forced to dance in them, and her feet would burn and burn every time she would dance in them, making her die and making her meet her demise and die. And that's the end of Snow White. So I hope you enjoyed this version of Snow White, and tell me your thoughts if you thought this scene was pretty dark and stuff. And tell me what you think about the story. And this is Doxy Loxy signing off from the Tower of Terror. And I'll see you next time on the next dark story where we discuss the story of Pinocchio.